Today I'll be reviewing the Eastern Greek Orthodox Bible New Testament, which is this book that you're looking at now. Take a look at the spine as well. And the back, which contains a few words of description. And then the features here. It says it has an 11-point font, and we'll see in what sense that's true. Long-lasting paper that's thick. It is very thick. We'll talk about that as well. And here is the ISBN. To give you a sense for how large it is, it's quite large for just a New Testament. It's 9.06 inches tall, 6.02 inches wide, 9.06 inches tall, and it's 1.8 inches thick. This is the Orthodox Study Bible New Testament and Psalms, which came out back in the 1990s. And so it's comparable in terms of content. It does have the Psalms in addition. And as you can see, although it's a bit taller than the EOB New Testament, it's considerably thinner and roughly the same width. Much thinner paper, much thicker paper in the EOB New Testament. This is the entire Orthodox Study Bible, which we've seen in one of these reviews before. Just a bit taller than the EOB New Testament, and a bit wider, but not nearly so thick. So this contains the entire Old Testament, New Testament, and all the deuterocanonical books that are canonical in the Orthodox Church. This contains only 27 books of the New Testament. So I gave you the dimensions. We'll go into it immediately so you won't have to wait to see what it looks like. This is essentially the layout. You have a single column of text, 100 millimeters wide, with roughly 69 characters per line. I was not able to count the number of lines per page because, as you can see, there are multiple wide gaps between the paragraphs, and you also have headings in the text. And then just about every page, in fact I couldn't find a page that doesn't have notes at the bottom of the page. The page dimensions are the same as the book dimensions. 230 millimeters tall, 153 millimeters wide. That's 9.06 inches tall, 6.02 inches wide. Margins at the top here, about 16 millimeters from the line to the top. From the bottom, below this line of note text here to the bottom of the page, is about 20 millimeters. The inner margin is quite wide for an inner margin. It is about 16 millimeters. I'm sorry, 26 millimeters. And the outer margin is about 17 to 18. It depends on the page, but it varies in that range. The font, they said 11-point font. When I compare it to my card with Times New Roman written on it, it compares nicely to 9.5. That's both the capitals and the lowercase letters. But if you measure the height of a large paragraph and then divide by the number of lines in the distance that you're measuring, you get the line height. And I measured that to be 3.95 millimeters, which is 11.2 points. So in a sense it is an 11-point font. The characters aren't that big, but the line spacing, which is really quite generous, as you can see there, and very easy on the eyes, is about 11 points. Space there between the paragraphs helps as well. There are verse numbers in the text, as you can see. They're fairly easy to find. And it is not line matched, but this paper is so thick that really doesn't matter. Let's talk a little bit about the notes. The notes at the bottom of the pages are either a translation note, like here He gives an alternate translation or another alternate translation. Sometimes references like this here. Sometimes there will be text notes. So by CT, he means, I'm talking about the editor, CT, it means the modern critical text, which for him was probably the Nestle-Aland 27th edition. So he tells you what different text bases give. We'll take a look at the introduction in a few minutes, and I'll give some examples of the kinds of things that you find here. The font down here in the notes is 7.5 points when I compare it to a Times New Roman. There are no references, either in a side column or at the bottom of the page, except what you would see here, such as this one that says Isaiah 66:24. Isaiah 66:24. In the back of the book, there is no concordance, there are no maps. You have a few articles. We'll see those when we look at the table of contents. Book titles. Each book begins on its own page. The title of the book is on the right-hand page, but on the left-hand page you find the title of this volume. So it says EOB New Testament always on the left page, and on the right page you get the title of the book in both English and in capital Greek letters. Page numbers, as you see here, are in the inside of the left-hand page. There is no indication at the top of the page of what the contents are, which is a bit of a drawback. It makes it a bit hard for you to find your place. You have to look to see if you can find a chapter number and then find the book at the top of the page. Headings in the text. These are very helpful. They're in sort of a bold italic. Again, the characters are about 9.5 points tall. The introductions and the articles in the back. Let's find an introduction. The introductions, here's the introduction to the Synoptic Gospels and Acts. The introductions there are in about a 10-point font. So we will talk a little bit about paper now. I'll move the lamp back so we can see if we get any kind of a sheen. Let's move the camera angle up. And really very little in the way of gloss. It's a very matte paper. I like it a lot. Very thick. I measured the sheet thickness at 124 micrometers. So the estimated paper weight is 113 GSM. If you look at this page, you can see some darkness there. You can see hints at writing down below. You turn the page and you see, in fact, there's a very dark icon on the other side. Very minimal show through. It's not quite white paper. There's sort of a light yellow hue. And I think if you look in the gutter, in the gutter you can see a bit of a glow in there that's yellowish to yellow-green. I looked for print non-uniformity. It's minimal. It's very well printed. It's a glued binding, as you can tell, and it does not lie flat. It lies about like that, and you have to hold it open. So it's a good idea to have a book stand for this book. So now we're back to the front cover, and when we open that we find a presentation page. After that is the title page. Very nice, open, attractive font. Pages are somewhat difficult to turn, at least as I'm holding them here, trying to hold the book open with my other hand. Another more detailed title page with a Chi-Rho, with the Alpha and the Omega in the center. On the back side of that is the copyright page, with giving ISBNs and the EOB website, which I do not think is any longer being operated. I attempted to go to it and I got a message saying that the site was for sale. Here is a icon of the Lord's baptism. And then we have a dedication page, followed by abbreviations and codes. You'll see some of these in the footnotes. The square brackets are for words added by the translator for clarity and accuracy. They can be either included or skipped in public reading. So rather than use italics for translator-supplied words, he uses these square brackets. Curly brackets are words added for theological clarity and accuracy, and they can be dropped for public reading. And then these angle brackets, the less than and greater than sign there, indicate words that have been added to the Byzantine textual tradition for the purpose of clarification, harmonization, or liturgical use, and which are present in the Patriarchal Text. We'll talk about what that is in a moment, but which may not have been part of the original manuscripts. So doubtful passages are in single brackets. I haven't found it here anywhere in the book, in the EOB itself, but he sometimes uses double angle brackets, so less than at one end of a passage, greater than at the other end. And all I can think is that that must mean that those passages are especially doubtful. Then we have a series of abbreviations. Those will appear in the footnotes. On the back side of the same page, more. For instance, MT means the majority text. NAB is the New American Bible, that's the Catholic Bible. And OSB is the Orthodox Study Bible that you saw a moment ago when I did the size comparisons. YLT, Young's Literal Translation. TR is the Textus Receptus, that comes up quite a lot. And here we are at the table of contents. Now, the table of contents begins with an introductory section, which we will look at in just a moment. Then we go to the Gospels and Acts. There's an introduction to the Synoptic Gospels and the book of Acts. Then we have those books. Then we go to the Epistles and Revelation section, and there's a separate introduction to the Pauline epistles. We go forward a bit more, and you notice that Hebrews is included amongst the Pauline epistles. There is on page 504 an introduction to the other epistles, and then on page 541 an introduction to the Revelation of John. At the end of the book, we will look at these very briefly. It are a series of 7 appendices that talk about various topics. Presbyters and bishops, the church and the apostles. This is very deep ecclesiology here. Jesus is God, the Filioque controversy. That's the addition made in the West to the Constantinopolitan Creed, which was finalized in about 381. The West unilaterally added the words "and from the Son" in terms of where the Holy Spirit proceeds from, and it was never agreed to in the East. Who are the brothers of the Lord? What does that mean? The ending of Mark, which is actually an adaptation of an article by James Snap, and the second Canaan controversy. Again, we'll just see those. We won't talk about those in any detail. Here we are with the Greek alphabet. Manuscript codes, because the author, editor, is interested in the manuscripts behind the modern critical text, and so the readings from those are mentioned from time to time. Most of those are older manuscripts. Then we get to the introduction. Why is there an EOB? And one of the reasons is to offer an accurate and scholarly translation of the Greek text, free of the theological bias that's affected other translations. He points to the NIV not using tradition here, and the NAB not giving a reason for divorce there. But I think that's actually because, in this case, it's because of the underlying text. In this case, it is because of the translator's bias. Some of the abbreviations that are used: Patriarchal Text, Textus Receptus, Majority Text, and Critical Text. He mentions one of the problems with the King James Version is that the Old Testament is based on the Masoretic text rather than the Septuagint. The Septuagint, of course, is what the Orthodox use as the basis of the Old Testament. That is sort of the confessional Old Testament that the Church has accepted and received through the years. So if you were to take a canonical approach to the text of Scripture, I would wonder why you would not take a canonical approach to the Old Testament being the Septuagint. EOB footnotes, they refrain from being from being extensive theological or doctrinal interpretations. They focus on textual and translation issues. Primary Greek text is the Greek text published by the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople in 1904, the so-called Patriarchal Text, or PT. The PT, as we will see, is very similar to the majority text. He says that here, very close to the majority text, although it does seem to have had the intrusion of some readings from the received text. Received text is the text family, a family of editions of the Greek text, printed editions that began with Erasmus's text in 1516 and continued into the 1600s. He talks about other text types, Byzantine text. He talks about Hodges and Farstad's majority text, understanding text and variants. So he's just letting you know that in the footnotes he's going to be talking about variant readings that could have been in the main text but weren't translated there because they're not part of the patriarchal text. The EOB New Testament began as a revision of the World English Bible. I looked at a passage or two in the World English Bible and compared them to this edition, and the changes are very extensive. It doesn't read very much like the original at all. Then there follows here in the introduction some words about translation philosophy for different issues. He starts by talking about how he translates Greek words that have to do with offices in the church. And he's decided that deacon is the proper translation of diakonos. Presbyteros comes across as presbyter, and rather than using bishop for episkopos, he uses overseer. One would have anticipated bishop, but he gives his reasons here. He distinguishes between two Greek words for temple and sanctuary. He's very careful in distinguishing Hades from Gehenna. There's an extensive several pages here that talk about proskuneo and proskuneo, to worship, and that comes across here is to express adoration. He decided to always translate proskuneo as to express adoration. Latreia is always rendered by the expression to offer divine service. And then we have a table that talks about how to whom these different words refer in various passages in the New Testament when they are used. There's several paragraphs here about kingdom, and it kind of makes the argument that perhaps kingdom should have been rendered as reign, but he decides in the end to opt for a kingdom. Talks about pronouns, and they do not capitalize pronouns here, but he sometimes replaces he with Jesus in order to clarify things. He gives both the Greek style of a name and the more modern Masoretic style in the New Testament text. The names to the left are what you're used to seeing in the King James Bible. The names on the right-hand side of the slash are what you're used to seeing in more modern translations. Gender forms, this is fairly conservative in terms of gender. He often uses a phrase like the one who rather than he who. because the rendition is both faithful to the text and intention of the author, and is reasonably inclusive. He uses brethren for adelphoi, but he acknowledges that it often means brothers and sisters. He does not capitalize pronouns, but he does capitalize Lord, Spirit, Lamb, Son of God. Talks a bit about Spirit here, and explains why he usually puts a footnote when Spirit is used in the text, in order to explain in the context which notion of Spirit is included there. He says his punctuation might seem a little odd, but since he's making this for public and personal reading, he wanted to make it easy to follow. And usually amen, amen is translated truly, truly. And we will look at the introduction to the other epistles, often called the Catholic epistles. And that'll give you a sense for the level of detail you have. So here is what you should expect. This is James. It gives you a short paragraph on authorship and date, and a few bullets on themes. Similar here, the epistles of John, and a few bullets. Petrine epistles and the epistles of Jude are all kind of wrapped up here in this discussion. He talks quite a bit about 2 Peter and questions about its authorship. Extensive quotation here from the New Testament introduction, published by the Atlantic Baptist Seminary in Canada. And then that kind of wraps it up. So that's a rather short introduction to the Catholic epistles. In this section, I'd like to give you a feel for the way this translation reads. And so what I've done is I've prepared a number of charts that'll allow you to see that contain sections from the text, and also show it in contrast to the New King James Version. So we'll start with the first one here, with a reading from Matthew 2, verses 1 through 3. And you see there on the left-hand screen the text from the New King James Version, and on the right from the Eastern Orthodox Bible New Testament, the book that we're reviewing today. And here in this particular passage, there are really only two significant differences between the way it's translated. One is where the New King James Version uses the older style he who. The EOB uses the one who. Now, since Jesus is he, I think he who makes perfect sense there. The second difference shows you how he's decided to translate the word for worship as express adoration too. And I think it comes across as a bit clunky there, but it's not really a very bad translation in my view. The next stop will be in the book of Acts at chapter 9, verses 5 and 6. And so the chart shows you again the New King James Version on the left, and it indicates in red there that there are words that are in the New King James Version that are not in the EOB New Testament, and that's because they're translated from different texts. New King James Version from the Textus Receptus, the same text basis as the King James Version, and the Eastern Orthodox Bible New Testament from the Patriarchal Text. And the Patriarchal Text does not contain that section there in red, where it's hard for you to kick against the goads, etc. The third example I'd like to show is from 1 John, and that is the famous Comma Johanneum here. And you will see that in fact it is in the text, although it is in the text in these angled less than, greater than brackets. And then the note down below here says only a few recent Greek manuscripts include this clause. but it is part of the Patriarchal Text, although it's in smaller characters. And because of that, it's included in these single angle brackets in the main text of the EOB NT. But sometimes he uses the double angle brackets, and I think that must mean that he thinks that this patriarchal text of 1 John 5, 7 through 8 is not quite as uncertain as some other sections. But here on this chart you can see that it's essentially the same. Translation's a bit different, but not in any significant way. Fourth change is here in the book of Revelation at the end, and this again shows you a difference between the text basis. So we're looking at Revelation 22:19, and as you can see from the chart, the only significant difference there is that the Eastern Orthodox Bible uses the word tree because it's translating the Greek word for tree, and the Textus Receptus has the word for book in that location. Okay, now the extensive passage here may be very difficult for you to see in the chart unless you're looking at it full screen on your computer, but I'm going to show you here John 7:53 through 8:11 in both the New King James Version and this Eastern Orthodox Bible New Testament side by side. So as you look, you see a number of changes beginning there in verse 4, where the Textus Receptus based in KJV has "this woman was caught," while the EOB has "we found this woman." Then in verse 5, where the Textus Receptus says "Moses in the law commanded us," the Patriarchal Text has "in our law Moses commanded us." So it's a rearrangement of words. Textus Receptus says that such should be stoned, whereas the Patriarchal Text says to stone such. In verse 6, the Textus Receptus includes "with his finger," which the Patriarchal Text has in verse 8, not in verse 6. Textus Receptus includes "as though he did not hear" in verse 6. That is not in the Patriarchal Text at all. In verse 7, Textus Receptus has a comment about Jesus raising himself up, whereas the Patriarchal Text has him looking up. We mentioned the issue with the finger in verse 8. Verse 8 in the Textus Receptus. Verse 9 in the Textus Receptus includes being convicted by their conscience, which is absent in the Patriarchal Text. Verse 10, instead of having "and saw no one but the woman," the Patriarchal Text has no comment there at all. But also Jesus asks the woman, "Where are they?" in the Patriarchal Text, but the Textus Receptus says, "Where are those accusers of yours?" Also in the same verse, the Textus Receptus has Jesus saying something to her, that is, to the woman. And in verse 10 in the Patriarchal Text, it's just "Jesus said." Finally, there are some differences there in verse 11, where in the Textus Receptus, Jesus said to her, "Neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more." The Patriarchal Text has, "Go your way, and from now on, sin no more." The the differences between the Patriarchal Text and the Majority Text, between the Patriarchal Text and the Textus Receptus, usually bring the Patriarchal Text closer to the Majority Text. It is that text that was constructed in the 20th century by Hodges and Farstad based on a large number of Greek manuscripts, rather than the Textus Receptus, which was constructed in a similar way in the 16th century using far fewer manuscripts. So hopefully that little exercise gave you a sense for the translation, its character, and some of the differences between the Patriarchal Text and the old Textus Receptus. This chart's intended to give you that perspective in an overview form, where I've looked at 13 different fairly significant passages in the New Testament where the majority text differs from the Textus Receptus, and you can see there that in only 3 of those instances does the Patriarchal Text side with the Textus Receptus against the majority text. I also looked at 23 differences in the Gospel of Matthew, and of those instances where the majority text differs from the Textus Receptus, the Patriarchal Text lined up with the majority text 17 times out of 23. So Patriarchal Text seems to agree with the majority text at about 70-75% of the time. Yeah, certainly in excess of 70% of the time. We mentioned earlier that there are 7 appendices in the back, and I'm not going to show them or in any detail at all here. I want to talk just briefly about Appendix A, which gives an argument in favor of the monarchical episcopacy. And it does so by arguing from the letters of Ignatius of Antioch that even though the word elders was used of every elder, and only later did the word bishop come to mean the president of the collection of elders in the congregation, that in fact there was always one who was in charge, one who was above the others. It doesn't touch upon how that monarchical episcopacy spread into sort of over a large area beyond the congregation, and it doesn't really talk to the objections raised in detail by Presbyterian authors like Thomas Crawford. I'm showing you a close-up now of some text from Romans 10 in preparation for doing a font comparison or two. I just want to say that this is a very pleasant reading experience, partially because of this line spacing, and partially because there's no show-through, or very, very little. It's almost undetectable. That's the advantage of having very thick paper. Disadvantage, of course, is this volume is bulky. It's just the New Testament, and it's larger than most Bibles. This is the, coming over the top, is the Orthodox Study Bible New Testament that was published in the 1990s, and it's in Matthew there on the right. And I think the characters are roughly the same size. They're very comparable. The one on the right will look a bit larger than it actually is because it's closer to the camera. But you do have a show-through issue on the one on the right. Not as bad as you'll see in the very next one. The old Orthodox Study Bible New Testament, although it did have these nasty red letters, was in verse-by-verse format, and that certainly has advantages. And it also had center column references, which, although they weren't in page order, were easy enough to use. But they got rid of those when they came out with the full Orthodox Study Bible, which is here. We're, of course, in the Old Testament to try to put things as close to each other on the same plane as possible, although the font on the right is darker, a bit larger. The line spacing isn't near as generous, and there is all kinds of show-through there on the right. Ghosting is a serious issue there in the Orthodox Study Bible. So if you're just interested in the New Testament, and you don't want the Orthodox Study Bible's rather extensive theological notes, then this is perhaps a preferable volume. We're just about ready to sum up now. I like the Eastern Orthodox Bible. I think the translation is, although not radically different from the New King James Version, it's a good translation. Unlike the WEB, which was its parent, it does not use contractions. I like that a lot. The quality of the print is quite good. It's a very easy read, particularly pleasant to the eyes. The footnotes contain quite a lot of useful information, both from a textual point of view and from a translational point of view. There is some quirkiness to the translation that express adoration to, for instance. But all in all, I think it's a very good book, very good translation of the New Testament. On the downside, it's very large for just the New Testament, and it is a glued binding, so it's not likely to last heavy use very long. Back on the plus side, you do have a lot of marginal space for taking notes as well. So with that, I'll conclude my review of the Eastern Orthodox, Eastern/Greek Orthodox New Testament, and appreciate your watching and your liking and subscribing if you feel so inclined. Thanks for watching.